major international events that occurred during the Carter years. First off, there was the Soviet-Afghan War. The U.S. secretly supplied funds against anti-communists in Afghanistan. The Soviets, fearing that a revolt in Afghanistan would start an uprising by all the Muslims living in Soviet territory, a total of 40 million of them. The Soviets could not allow that to happen, so they sent troops to quell the uprising. The second major event is the Camp David Accords. The U.S. led by President Jimmy Carter, helped mediate a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, mostly ending their conflicts together. A third international event that occurred was the Iranian Revolution that began in 1979, which overthrew the unpopular Shah. However, the Americans accepted the Shah into U.S. territory for medical treatment to cure his cancer. This caused rallies to storm into the U.S. embassy in Tehran, leading to 52 U.S. citizens and diplomats being held for 444 days. This event effectively destroyed President Jimmy Carter's chance for a re-election. The fourth major event that occurred was the Panama Canal Treaty, which was signed by President Carter in 1977, which stating that the U.S. would cede control over the canal in the year 2000, and these are the major international events that occurred under President Jimmy Carter.
Next, I will be covering Carter's policies in relation to the Cold War through the use of SALT II, the Carter Doctrine, boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games, and the 1980 Green Embargo. SALT II is a second strategic arms limitation talk between the United States and the Soviet Union. This policy was set to reduce production of nuclear weapons. However, the US withdrew from the agreement nearly 6 months later due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which also directly contributes to the boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. As a result of Soviet aggression in Afghanistan, 65 nations led by the US boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, harming the Soviet Union's reputation and international legitimacy. Furthermore, lack of competition in the Games degraded the quality of the event, and the Soviet responded by boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. The same year, the US placed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union, forcing them to find other trade partners that had around 25% higher costs than the US. This was a major success, as the USSR relied heavily on trade for food, and as a result, had to increase spending. Last but not least, the Carter Doctrine was founded to establish American control over the Persian Gulf region. This region was of high interest to the US, as it was rich in oil and gas, and Carter threatened military intervention to counteract Soviet aggression in the region.
In Carter's human rights policy, he made promises that characterized it, such as to reduce containment and end foreign policy supporting dictators against communism, to reduce arms sales, slow the arms race, and reduce U.S. military presence overseas, to address environmental issues, and to be hard against nations that abuse human rights. We can look at his policy from two main perspectives. One, that Carter had an absolute commitment to human rights, and two, that his implementation of his human rights policy was inconsistent. His absolute commitment is shown through how he denied military and economic assistance to countries that abused human rights, such as Guatemala, Chile, and Argentina, and his inconsistencies in his human rights policy is shown through after the coup in El Salvador, where the U.S. continued providing military assistance, leading to 10,000 political murders committed in 1980. The Panama Canal Treaty started with the Hay-Bonneau-Varilla Treaty in November 1903, which gave the U.S. the right to build the canal in Panama. Under President Ford, negotiations began regarding the canal, but there was opposition to returning it to Panama. When Carter came to office, he made the negotiations a priority. He saw it as a constructive approach to improving hemispheric relations and also saw it as important for promoting economic stability for the region. In September 1977, Carter and Panamanian President Omar Torrijos signed 2 treaties returning the land and canal to Panama. Through all of this, Carter successfully achieved his primary foreign policy goal.
Okay, for reasons for the policy, the first one being the Panama Canal Treaty. Carter recognized that the failure to negotiate new treaties would create a barrier to good relations, and the best way to prevent extremists from closing the canal was to end U.S. dominance. This push towards good relations and end U.S. dominance is different from Reagan's point of view, as he wanted to keep this canal open by asserting U.S. dominance and keeping American occupation in it. This new treaty was needed because the old treaty made Panamanians second-class citizens in their own country, and the old treaty endangered the canal, while new relations with Panama would protect it. This canal wasn't really popular with the people there, as seen in riots in 1964. Carter recognized that the better the relationships between the U.S. and Panama, the more likely this canal would remain open and functioning. For human rights policies, Carter wanted to emphasize high moral principles. He wanted to push towards the historical vision of America's role, and as well as go back to larger views of global change. There are many reasons for this, but one of the main ones was the failure of the Vietnam War. Carter describes the failure of the Vietnam War as fighting fire with fire, and he continues saying that the fire really should be fought with water. He wanted to put an end to the human rights abusers as allies. The U.S. had a long history of doing this, as seen in the Vietnam War for one, and as well as the Korean War.
The Panama Canal Treaties and also the human rights priority had several implications on the region, two main being the Panama's improving hemispheric relations and also setting the precedent for the United States. Moving to our first implication on Panama's economic recovery and improving hemispheric relations, in the 1970s, Panama was indeed a struggling economy, and the financial returns of the canal seemed crucial to keeping the country in the U.S. sphere. However, some historians counter this, saying that Panama wouldn't have left the sphere because of it signing the non-aligned movement. However, the problem is that seeing normal historical precedents, historians point to the fact that economic struggle usually led to increased resentment of the United States, and it probably leading to focus. And Jimmy Carter worried that Panama would go on to going to the Soviets and trying to get some economic help instead of focusing on the United States. Moving on to the human rights priority and talking about looking at how now, because of Jimmy Carter and focusing on how they're not going to support dictatorial regimes, Guatemala, Chile, and Argentina all lost funding, and then now the U.S. wasn't associated with these regimes. However, because if you look at the El Salvador coup, the United States reverted back to the old ways and nothing really changed. Their contradictory foreign policy ultimately stirred up revolutions as it breeded resentment. However, to counter this, simply this is wrong just because of the fact that it began the narrative of the United States being a champion for human rights and ultimately affected the region, as it showed that being a dictatorship and focusing on human rights was an important task for these places.